A lot of pressure will be building on Congress, given the fact that he is going to have these meetings. And to Joe's point, that one-on-one with Mike Johnson is going to be really important. How far along with you are Congress getting any of this done before they're supposed to leave on Friday?
Well, there's almost no shot that the whole thing's going to get done before they leave for the year. The House is planning to leave on Friday, and there's no sign that they're going to budge from that. They're nowhere in terms of getting any of this aid done. There's some possibility the Senate might stay around an extra week, work until December 22nd before taking off for the holidays. And they are trying to work on a bipartisan compromise to do with the border and Ukraine. Senator Chris Murphy, one of the lead negotiators, was talking with a Bloomberg reporter just shortly before we went on the air, and he suggested that, right now it's still pretty hard to see. He said there's a path, but it's faint.
I found it fascinating to listen to remarks from Chris Murphy, the Democrat, and James Lankford, the Republican negotiator in this case, both saying within 24 hours of each other, almost word for word, we're not likely to get everything we want on the border. And it does make you wonder, Mike, that even with all the noise, we might be getting closer to something. Dick Durbin spoke with Punchbowl from Guatemala, where they were pursuing a codel to learn more about this. The quote, "We cannot ignore the reality of the numbers and where they're coming from." This is the number 2 Democrat in the Senate.
Yeah, who represents Chicago, where 2/3 of the budget deficit that's coming up, that's giant for this year, they attribute to the surge in migration. So Dick Durbin...
That's closer than we were a couple months ago.
Yeah, no, so there's talk here. And the very fact that behind the scenes there's talk that Schumer might keep the Senate in another week tells you that there's a possibility that they might get a deal that is at least acceptable to the Senate Republicans. If the Senate Republicans come to a deal with the Democrats, right now, basically the House is just saying, no way, my way or the highway. But if they come together and they get a reasonable number of Republican senators behind them, that then creates pressure on the House to do something.
Well, why doesn't the president jump in? Some are speculating maybe he will. But wouldn't that speed it up if he was part of the negotiations and to help cut the deal?
Arguably, it depends on the dynamics. They right now feel like the better course is to have someone like Chris Murphy representing the Democratic interests. If you have Biden jump in, then it could be more of a, what do you think, a Biden type of deal, and that would make it harder for Republicans. By keeping it in as a Senate negotiation, although you better believe that Murphy's on the phone with the Biden White House, and surely Schumer is. It would be something that he wouldn't get too far from what Biden would accept. But that keeps it, the thinking is sometimes these inside the Senate negotiations, they can go a little further when they're trying because it's not Schumer or Biden who's saying, let's make this offer, because if it doesn't work, then it's not Biden that's responsible.
Well, all of this, of course, resonating on the campaign trail, where Donald Trump had another fascinating weekend, almost trying to normalize this idea of being a dictator, even if only on the first day. He spoke to the New York Young Republicans Club. Here he is.
Baker today in the New York Times, he said that I want to be a dictator. I didn't say that. I said I want to be a dictator for one day. But the New York Times said, and you know why I wanted to be a dictator? Because I want a wall, right? I want a wall, and I want to drill, drill, drill.
Referring to Peter Baker there. Now, I thought he finished the wall. He keeps telling us that, even though we don't have physical evidence of that. But, Nancy, you've been covering the Trump campaign. Your thoughts on this dictator remark and how it may or may not play, because I'm of the mind that he just likes getting people like us to talk about it. The fact of the matter is he has a commanding lead in Iowa. This new Ann Selzer poll blows it out of the water. Is this essentially done in the first state that will vote in January?
Well, I think the new Iowa poll that came out really should give his rivals a lot of pause.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he is so far ahead in the polls with, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis polling below 20% in that poll. They really have not been able to make up the ground. DeSantis in particular has been to all 99 counties in Iowa at this point. He has spent so much time there, really invested a ton of resources. You know, Trump has been there like a handful of times, will go, I think, a bit more before the caucuses, but really has not invested the same amount of time. But it doesn't matter because he is still really the star with Republican primary voters. And you hear that in Iowa, you hear that in New Hampshire, you hear that in South Carolina. And I think the Trump campaign hopes that it can really dominate these early primaries and lock up the nomination pretty early in the year.
Ron DeSantis and his family spend so much time in Iowa. God. So it's really, I'm sure these poll numbers are devastating for him. And I'm glad you brought that up because we heard from his wife over the weekend, Casey DeSantis, in a Fox News interview saying that they are encouraging out-of-state volunteers to come to Iowa to caucus for her husband.
We're asking all of these moms and grandmoms to come from wherever it might be, North Carolina, South Carolina, and to descend upon the state of Iowa to be a part of the caucus, because you do not have to be a resident of Iowa to be able to participate in the caucus. So moms and grandmoms are going to be able to come and be a part and to let their voice be heard in support of Ron DeSantis.
Nancy, you have detailed reporting about how bad things are for the DeSantis camp, specifically in Iowa, where they spent all this time and political capital and tons of money.
The DeSantis campaign, one source described it to me as like the infrastructure around it has really been crumbling. And so, they have the super PAC, the allied super PAC fighting with the campaign. I would think Ron DeSantis is not necessarily the candidate that a lot of Republicans thought that he would be. He's not a great retail politician. He's not great at small talk. He has a hard time winning over crowds. And I think that it's just been this confluence of things where, if we look at this time last year, I think people really thought that he was the person to take on Trump. He would be a dominant figure in the Republican Party, and he has never really caught on. And then there have been a lot of self-inflicted errors that his campaign and his super PAC have made.
Well, should we acknowledge right now that you actually cannot just come from any state to
You have to be a legal resident to vote in the Iowa caucuses.
And maybe
the Iowa
volunteers somehow.
Yeah, the Iowa GOP put this out as well over the weekend, potentially, I think, because of Casey DeSantis' comments.
I'm sure. You must be legal. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Bring your photo ID, Mike Dorning. What does this say about all of the media attention focused on Nikki Haley, who we hear is surging? But you see a number like this, you talk to somebody like Nancy, who's hearing directly from voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, and you wonder.
Yeah, no, she's surging compared to where she was to a place that's still like tied for second by like, 30 percentage points or something. It's just a piddling place. Her hope is that over time she can come together. In Iowa caucuses, you do sometimes see a big change late in the game where people can coalesce. Certainly that's happened in the past with Santorum. It's happened in the past with John Kerry. I don't believe that anyone has ever been able to make up anything even close to this kind of deficit. Even in these giant come-from-behind stories that you've seen in prior Iowa caucuses, they weren't this far behind. And when we think about this as a competitive primary, we forget that Trump is essentially, especially to the Republican Party, the same thing as an incumbent president. And he really does have that power of incumbency for Republicans. It's really, really tough to beat an incumbent president in a primary. You have to go back to, LBJ, and he didn't even fight his way through.